As you might know by now, I'm a guitarist and I've been playing for 6 years, and like so many other guitarists out there, I subscribe to tons of guitar channels here on YouTube, and one of my favorite channels is Paul Davids'es channel. A little over a week ago, he put out this video called "Is this the hardest riff to play on guitar?" Frusciante. And obviously it's a riff by John Frusciante, the guitarist of Red Hot Chili Peppers. The song is called Snow Hey-O. And as a longtime Chili Peppers fan, I thought, alright, why not do it? Why not take the challenge and learn this riff that apparently is so hard to learn? So here's what happened when I took Paul Davids'es tips and implemented them. Did they work? Did they not work? Let's see what happened. Now, in the beginning of this video, Davids chooses to question people's beliefs about how hard this riff actually is to play. And sure enough, he debunks the myth. He can play it, I can play it, and so can you. And Davids comes out with 4 reasons why this song is so difficult to play. So the first reason why this song can be so hard to play is because of the chord changes. The backbone of the melody is based on these 3 notes that make up a chord. This chord shape or melodic pattern is the first thing that I personally decided to focus on when I learned this riff. In the actual video, you can see Davids playing it at this speed. But this was obviously a lot more challenging for me as a beginner. So here's what I did. I chose to do a combination of up and down strokes, and one of the biggest challenges for me was to go from the A string to the D string, or from the G string back to the D string again. If we start to ascend like this, we have to find a way back to the D string without strumming the G string. And that can be really, really hard if you're holding your pick straight down like this. So once we've ascended, we need to jump over or skip the G string that we've just strummed. The most effortless way of doing this that I've found is by using the pick slanting technique. And this is where you, instead of holding the pick in a 90-degree angle, you kind of bend it and make this arching movement instead. Instead of moving the pick with your hand, you sort of flip it by extending your thumb. Now that your pick is placed over the string, it's way easier to skip that G string once you're coming down again. And you're doing the exact same thing when you're trying to avoid the A string as well. The only difference is that you slant the pick upwards instead of downwards. Now, there is a way to learn this even faster though, and that is if you mute all the strings with your left hand. You don't want to focus on your fretting hand at all, and then you only try to focus on the movement of your strumming hand. So the idea here is that your brain is very good at taking in small snippets of information. So if you're trying to play synchronized, then your brain has to follow along with 2 different things, both your fretting hand and the movement of your strumming hand. So you're isolating the movement of your strumming hand and trying to learn that as best as possible, and that will give you a better result. So what I would suggest you do is put on a metronome with a speed that's challenging enough, but you want to be able to follow along with this. And while you play the strumming pattern, you want to try to visualize or imagine the notes of the song in your head. And if you feel like that is hard, you can of course hum the different notes or sing it if you want to. So that's only the picking pattern of one of these chords. Now the picking pattern is basically the same for all the different chords that is played here, but the chord changes themselves can actually be pretty hard if you're a beginner guitarist. Davids also mentioned this in his video where he talked about how a lot of new guitarists will get these dead notes because they don't press properly down on the different frets. So if you're one of those people who have problems with switching, you can try to sit down also with a metronome as well and do it like this. You don't necessarily have to go through all the chords at the same time. You can break it down into 2 of the chords and practice switching between those. A lot of these exercises come down to just deconstructing and making things as simple as possible. By making things simple and deconstructing this riff, you make it a lot easier for yourself to learn it. Now, the second reason why this song is so hard to play, according to Davids'es and all the guitarists out there, is because of the tempo of the song, which is 104 beats per minute. With some simple math, Davids'es found out that you play approximately between 7 and 8 notes per second, which can be very intimidating for some guitarists out there. But trust me, if you know how to do this pick slanting technique that I showed you earlier, it should be very easy for you to speed up the riff. Now, what can be really challenging about this riff is that it's hard to play it clean once you get up to those 104 beats per minute. So what I would personally do, what I did to learn this riff, was I slowed down the metronome to maybe 80 beats per minute or maybe 70 even, and then I would play as clean as possible. And once I'd mastered playing it as clean as possible, succeeding like 80 or 90% of the times of playing the riff at that speed, I would increase it by 5 beats per minute. I like to go very slowly upwards to have a gradual learning process. So I would go from maybe 80 beats per minute to 85 to 90 to 95 and so on. If you do this diligently and you practice for maybe 20 minutes day in and day out, you will get results and you will get better. The third reason why this riff is so hard to play, according to Davids'es and other guitarists out there, is because of the picking. And that is something that I've already actually talked a lot about. Davids'es chooses to tackle this in a little bit of a different way than what I did though. He is using a form of alternate picking, a combination of up and down strokes, which he calls inside picking. And this is when the movement of the pick is in the opposite direction of the direction of where the hand is headed. Davids'es mentions how this picking technique is infamous for being really difficult to use at high speeds, and I can totally see why. With inside picking, you have to pick the 3 strings individually. You have to come down to each of the strings and pluck 3 times. When you're using the pick slanting technique that I showed you earlier, you only have to strum once, because you're basically using this sweeping movement to sweep all the strings in one strum. All you need to worry about in that case is to extend your thumb. Of course, there's a little bit of movement in your hand, but mainly just extend your thumb to reach out to the rest of the strings. The less required movement, the easier it is to play this at higher speeds. At least that's how I'm thinking about it. Now, it's entirely possible, obviously, to use both of these techniques, and you can choose for yourself. Personally, I don't really know what type of picking technique Frusciante is using. It would actually be really interesting to know. From this low quality clip right here from a 2006 concert, it actually looks like he's moving his hand up and down a lot, which might signal that he's using the inside picking technique. So Paul D, I congratulate you. The score is 1-0 in your favor, but I'll get you sometime. The fourth reason that Davids'es is mentioning in this video about why this riff is so hard to play is hammer-ons. If you're new to this and you haven't heard about the hammer-on technique before, it's essentially you strumming on one string with one finger, and then you slap your other finger on one of the other frets without strumming that note that is created. If you're brand new to this technique, then I highly suggest you isolate this movement as well from the rest of the riff so that you learn faster. You basically do the exact same thing as I showed you with your right hand, your picking motion. Play that technique over and over again with a metronome at, gradually increasing speeds, and you will nail it. The most difficult thing is not really nailing the hammer-on technique. It's more about this dynamic shift in volume, which you also hear Frusciante doing in the song. What I'm talking about here is, if you're listening to the song closely, you will hear that the hammer-on part, the notes of the hammer-on, is played a little bit louder. It has a louder volume compared to the other notes that is played earlier on. This can be really, really hard to do at high speeds. I was struggling a lot with this when I tried to learn this riff. So what I highly suggest you do in the beginning is that you play it very slowly, and then you try to exaggerate what Frusciante is doing. Obviously, there's a little bit of a difference between the volume. It's not too much of a difference, but it's noticeable, right? But in the beginning, to really hone in that technique or that habit of playing that part louder, you should exaggerate it to begin with, and because then it's easier to tone it down a bit later on. Now there's a whole other side of playing this riff that is making it really hard to play at times, that Davids actually didn't mention in his video, but I want to mention it here. So this is the fifth reason why this riff is so hard to play. It's because of tension. I don't know about you, but when I practiced this riff, I had a tendency to, whenever I did the hammer-on, I would bend the strings out of tuning, so it would sound very off. And sometimes I would push the strings and the frets down so hard that, if you push the frets down very hard, you can get them out of tuning by simply doing that. When you're learning a challenging riff, it's very easy to get carried away. You put a little bit of extra tension in your hand, maybe both in your fretting hand and your strumming hand. And because of that tension, you end up becoming very stiff. So you have to kind of ask yourself this question: what would it feel like if I played this riff and it was easy? The answer is that you would probably relax a little bit more. Now, this whole concept of tension is something that you can incorporate into another exercise. Again, you can sit down with a metronome, play at slow but still challenging speeds, and this time try to focus on how little effort you can put into playing the riff without making it sound off. You want to touch the strings as lightly as possible with your fretting hand, but still, putting enough force into it to get a sound out of the strings. Again, if you feel very stiff, not only in your fretting hand, but also maybe in your shoulder area, in your bicep maybe, your forearm, or simply in between your fingers of your picking hand, you can isolate it to only focus on the tension you have in your picking hand and in your right arm and shoulder. So that's essentially the 4 reasons why this riff is so hard to play, plus an additional reason why it's so hard to play, and a little bit more of a deconstruction of how you can learn it even faster and better, and kind of my personal view on it. As you might understand by now, learning to play Snow Hey-O by Red Hot Chili Peppers is a challenge, and you have to kind of think about learning the riff as a jigsaw puzzle. You have to pick all the pieces apart, deconstruct all the things that you should be able to do, and then practice each of these things individually. So that is my interpretation of Paul Davids'es video. There's a link to his original video down below if you want to check it out. It's amazing. And also, I hope you learned something from this. The most important part, I think, is just being patient with yourself and taking one thing at a time. Last but not least, a shout out to Christian O'Day and Dead Meat for supporting me over on Patreon. Thank you so much, guys. And if you haven't checked out my Patreon page already, there's a link down below. Click it. I'm building a library of lessons, guitar lessons of Queens of the Stone Age songs. So if that's your favorite band, or if that's a band that you like, you might want to head over there and check it out. And that's it. I'll talk to you later. Cheers.